It's been a few months now since our new neighbor Gary moved in. At first, I was perfectly fine with it. We didn't really get along with our old neighbors, but looking back, I sure miss them now. The whole thing was weird from the start. One day, there was suddenly this old van in the driveway next door. No moving trucks, no people carrying furniture, just that van. My wife Sarah and I figured it was nothing, so we decided to introduce ourselves, be friendly. We knocked on the door, but no one answered. Odd, because the van was right there. We figured maybe they were sleeping or out running errands, so we let it go. A few days later, Sarah and I were upstairs reading in bed. From our bedroom window, you can see into the backyard of Gary's place, which has a detached garage. His van hadn't been around all day, but suddenly, we heard his garage door open. Out of curiosity, we glanced through the blinds, and there he was, a middle-aged guy in a plain white t-shirt and jeans moving boxes from his van into the garage. The motion light flicked on, casting shadows over the scene. We watched for a minute, then turned away to avoid making it weird. That night, though, things got stranger. We were lying in bed, and out of nowhere we started hearing these scraping noises coming from his garage. It wasn't the usual clanging you'd expect from moving things around. There was something unsettling about the sound. Then came a loud bang, and that's when I got up to check. I crept to the window, pulled the blinds just a little, and saw Gary standing there. Only this time, he saw me too. His eyes met mine through the window, and I instantly felt a wave of discomfort. I quickly backed away, but moments later, I heard the garage door slam shut. "I'm going to go talk to him," I told Sarah. I figured it was the least I could do after getting caught staring. So I slipped on some shoes and headed outside. But before I even made it across the yard, I saw Gary in his van. As soon as he spotted me, he sped off down the street like he was running from something or someone. From that point on, I knew something was off with this guy. A few nights later, more scraping sounds came from the garage, and my curiosity got the better of me. I told Sarah I was going to check it out, and she watched from the window as I snuck into Gary's yard. When I reached the garage, I could hear those noises again. Thumps, bumps, and a metallic scraping. It sounded like something alive was trapped in there. "Hey, what are you doing?" Sarah's voice startled me from the window. I quickly backed off and headed back inside. Whatever was in that garage would have to remain a mystery for now. Later that night, Sarah shook me awake, whispering, "I heard the gate open." I told her she was imagining things, but her fear was palpable. I had no choice but to check. Grabbing a flashlight, I headed downstairs and peeked through the front door. The van was back in Gary's driveway. I crept into the backyard, flicked on the lights, and immediately heard someone running. The gate slammed behind them as they disappeared into the night. My heart raced, and despite the fear, I ran after them. But when I got to the gate, no one was there. I felt watched, like eyes were on me from every shadowed corner. I rushed back inside and told Sarah what happened. "Do you think it was Gary?" she asked wide-eyed. "I don't know," I replied. But now I wasn't just curious, I was genuinely concerned. The next morning I went to see Gene, a neighbor who lived 2 doors down. He hadn't met Gary either, but he mentioned that he'd been woken up several times by strange noises coming from the garage at night. When I told him about someone sneaking into our yard, Gene suggested we keep an eye on things together to see if we could finally meet this guy. That Saturday morning, as I opened the living room blinds, I saw Gary's van parked in the driveway for once. But what caught my attention wasn't the van, it was Gary. He was standing at one of his windows, staring straight at me. Unblinking, unmoving, like he was waiting for me to open the blinds. I waved awkwardly, expecting him to look away, but he didn't. He just kept staring. I called for Sarah, but by the time she got to the window, he was gone. "I'm done with this," I told her. We went next door, knocked on Gary's door, rang the bell, and even pounded on the door. Nothing. No sound from inside, just silence. Later that day, Gene came by again. He asked if I saw his text from the previous night. Apparently, he'd heard muffled crying coming from Gary's direction. My stomach dropped. Between the scraping sounds, the weird behavior, and now this. Something was definitely wrong. It's been almost 2 weeks now, and Gary's van hasn't returned. It's like he vanished. But at night, we still hear things. Thumps, bangs, scraping. Every time we check, the van isn't there. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever Gary was hiding in that garage, it's not gone. We moved out of that neighborhood when I was about 10, and honestly, I don't remember much of the details except for one night that my mom will never forget. It was late, probably around midnight. My dad wasn't home. He traveled a lot for work. It was just my mom, me, and my 2 younger siblings at the house. We lived in a pretty rough part of town, so naturally, my mom was always on edge when Dad wasn't around. Our neighbor, Mr. Daniels, had always been strange, kept to himself and never spoke much. He gave off this creepy vibe that my mom had always picked up on, though I was too young to notice. That night, something happened that still sends chills down my spine. We were all asleep when suddenly there was a knock at the door. My mom told me later that at first she thought it was some kids pulling a prank, but something about the sound unsettled her. She got up, quietly went to the door, and looked through the side window. No one was there. She hesitated but decided to let it go, thinking maybe it was just her imagination. She went back to bed. 30 minutes passed, and again the knocking started. This time it was more deliberate. Not the playful sound of kids, but something menacing. My mom crept to the door again, heart pounding, and peered through the window. Still, nothing. But this time, fear crept in. We lived in a place where you could never assume something was harmless. She went back to her bedroom and grabbed my dad's shotgun. That's when she made a decision. She wasn't going back to sleep. She sat there in the dark, the gun in her lap, eyes locked on the front door. Another knock. She stood up, peered through the window once more. Nobody. Her anxiety spiked. She yelled out, "I'm calling the cops. If anyone tries to come in, I'll shoot." There was silence. And then, the knocking stopped. By this point, my mom was certain that something was terribly wrong. She went to wake us up, still holding the shotgun in her hands, just in case. She didn't want to panic us, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that someone was trying to break in. The police finally arrived around 2 a.m. They did a sweep of the yard while we stayed huddled inside. When the officers came back, they asked my mom if a piece of barbed wire they found belonged to us. My mom said no, of course, and asked why they were asking. One of the officers explained that whoever had been knocking on the door was likely planning to strangle her with the wire if she had opened it. My mom went pale. The officer told her she did the right thing by not answering. They promised to patrol the area and do a more thorough investigation once the sun came up. Morning came, and as they searched the property, they discovered footprints leading around to the back of the house to my bedroom window. The wood on the windowsill was scratched, like someone had tried to pry it open. My mom's suspicions immediately turned to Mr. Daniels. She'd caught him staring into our house more than once. He always knew when my dad was away. He'd watch for my dad's car, probably knew his work schedule better than we did. My mom had never been comfortable with him, and after that night, she knew we couldn't stay there. Within weeks, we packed up and moved out of that neighborhood. We never heard from Mr. Daniels again, but sometimes I wonder what might have happened if my mom had opened that door. We were lucky. When I was 29, I finally saved enough to buy my first house. It wasn't anything special, just a modest place, but I was proud. Sure, it was in a bit of a rough neighborhood, but I figured it was a good start. Most of the neighbors seemed decent enough when I moved in. Some even invited me over for dinner. For someone who had spent most of their life in apartments, this was new and kind of nice. But not all of my neighbors were friendly. 2 houses down from me was a guy named George. He was probably in his 50s, and from the moment I moved in, he would knock on my door at the most absurd times of night. The first time it was something small. He asked if I had any extra bread. Then it was water because his was shut off. At first I didn't mind helping out, but after a few days of these late-night knocks, he started asking for money. That was when I drew the line. I started ignoring his knocks, hoping he'd take the hint. But it didn't stop. A few weeks after I moved in, there was another knock. It was past midnight, and I was about to ignore it like I had been, but this time something felt different. I peeked through the peephole and saw George standing there looking more distressed than usual. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked at me, clearly anxious, and said, "I just got a new grill. Can you help me figure out how to use it?" Now it was late, way too late for grilling, but George wasn't exactly the most conventional guy. I hesitated for a moment, but I'd always been into cooking and part of me thought it wouldn't hurt to help him out. I told him I'd be over in a minute after I put on some shoes. A few minutes later, I walked over to his house. His yard was overgrown, and as I stepped through the gate, I noticed there was no grill in sight. The backyard was eerily quiet, and his back door was wide open. No lights were on inside. "George?" I called out. A muffled voice came from somewhere inside. "Yeah, I'm down here. I need help with the meat in the freezer." The voice came from a dark stairwell just inside the door. I stepped closer but stopped short. Something didn't feel right. There were no lights. The whole house was pitch black. "Could you turn on a light?" "I can't see anything," I called down. There was a pause. Then George's voice replied, "The lights are broken. I can't turn them on." My gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. I backed away from the stairs and said, I think I'm just gonna head home." The second those words left my mouth, I heard it. Footsteps, fast, coming up the stairs. My heart shot into my throat, and I bolted. I ran back to my house as fast as I could, slamming and locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I yanked back the curtain to look outside, but George was nowhere in sight. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I had gone down those stairs. I wanted to call the police, but what would I even say? Nothing technically happened. For the next few days, I avoided leaving the house unless it was for work. I didn't see George once, and thankfully the knocks stopped. But something kept nagging at me. A week later, I was chatting with my neighbor across the street, an older guy named Jim. I told him what happened with George, thinking maybe he had some insight into what the deal was. But instead of nodding or laughing it off, Jim just stared at me, confused. "No one lives in that house," he said slowly. "It's been abandoned for at least 2 years." My blood ran cold. There was no way. I'd been talking to someone who knew my name, who knocked on my door repeatedly. Jim called the police after that. They came and checked the place out, but they didn't find anything. No sign of George, no grill, nothing. I moved out a few weeks later. To this day, I still don't know who that man was, what he wanted, or what he was trying to lure me into that night. But I'm glad I listened to my instincts.